All right, well, there's a certain kind of junk email I get several times a day. So these are from a person who identifies themselves as a missionary or a pastor, or more commonly, the relative of a recently deceased pastor in some foreign country. The message usually starts out, "Dearly beloved in Christ," and then it goes on to explain that they need me to respond to them right away because they have a huge amount of money to send me millions of dollars because all this money was legally earmarked for exactly the kind of ministry we have right here. So if I send them my information, then I'll get this money. So typically I just hit delete right away when I see those. I know that the sender has bought my email address from a broker who has scoured the internet for emails associated with churches or ministers. And by broker, I mean some guy sitting in his parents' basement somewhere in Utah or Eastern Europe. The messages are all so obviously some kind of a scam. And they all fit the same pattern. They're out to separate me from my money. So delete. It's just one of the downsides to the internet that so many people use it for malicious things. So you got to be on guard when anything remotely suspicious lands in your inbox. And it's especially sad when anyone uses religion as a way of trying to lure us or to frighten us into doing something crazy, like sending them a bunch of money. Of course, wouldn't be the first time in history that religious beliefs had been manipulated to get people to do dumb and crazy things. Back in 1096, during the First Crusade, there was a French monk who went by the name of Peter the Hermit. He was a compelling preacher who convinced about 30,000, mostly poor people, that God needed them to go to Jerusalem with him to rescue the Holy Land from Muslims. Now, the nice thing about going on a crusade, if you were a crusader, was not only that you thought you were doing something that would make God like you better, on the way, and then when you got there, you could steal and plunder all you wanted perfectly legitimately, and then potentially get rich. Well, to practice for their trip, Peter the Hermit's army first went through the Rhineland, and they massacred Jewish people wherever they could find them. Ugh. But most of Peter's group, and this was just a ragtag collection of peasants with absolutely no military training or equipment or funding. They never even made it past Turkey. They didn't get into the Holy Land. They were slaughtered, or they were captured and then sold into slavery. Sad episode. Another more recent example, and this one's not bloody at all, but it's still poignant, is the story of William Miller. William Miller was a preacher from Vermont, and based on his unique interpretations of the Bible and years of calculations, he publicly declared that the second coming of Christ would occur sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. Well, that gained William Miller a ton of publicity and a ton of followers from all over the country, and these people became known as Millerites. Millerites sold their belongings, all their property, quit their jobs, because why would they need those kinds of things anymore? And many of them moved to Vermont and upstate New York to be among fellow believers. Well, when Christ did not return in that time frame, Miller set a new date, April 18th, 1844. Once again, no Jesus. Finally, he said, once and for all, this is sure to be the date of October the 22nd. Again, people gathered in droves. They stayed up all day and all night, and nothing. So the newspapers called this the Great Disappointment. And as far as I know, the only truly wonderful thing that ever happened on October 22nd was that's Ellen's birthday. Definitely not a great disappointment, just the opposite. So the moral to these stories, I suppose, is that it is wise to be skeptical of big promises, especially if religion is involved, of wealth and plunder, or of predictions that the world as we know it is coming to an end. But the really big problem with those kinds of religious promises is they're ultimately selfish. They appeal to our basest instincts about what's going to serve us, or what's going to please us, or what's going to affirm our deep-seated needs about the way the world should be. And it sounds counterintuitive, but the easiest way to motivate a lot of people to meet those needs is to scare them, to frighten people with a false narrative that says the things that you value or that serve your needs will be taken away from you if you fail to act. I have to believe Moses was thinking that he was hearing something pretty crazy when one day he came across a burning bush speaking to him. Now, we all know the story. The people who made up the Hebrew tribes, they were being persecuted and they were enslaved in Egypt. Egypt was the world superpower, and Pharaoh was so large and in charge, he was literally regarded as a god in human form. When Moses was a baby, during one of the periodic persecutions and purges of Hebrews, Moses was saved through a weird twist of fate and raised as a prince of Egypt until he grew up and saw for himself how the Hebrews were being horribly mistreated. One day, he killed an Egyptian overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave horribly. So, Moses had to run away to escape a death sentence, and he ended up in the desolate wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. There, he met a nice girl, settled down, and worked for her father as a sheep herder. So, Moses had already lived a pretty full life by that point, and he certainly had no intention of ever setting foot back in Egypt. But one day, out on the job, minding his own business, in the shadow of Mount Horeb, also known more commonly as Mount Sinai, this scraggly bush begins to burn without truly burning up. Weird. And a voice comes out of it. "Take off your sandals. This is holy ground." Now, most people at that point would back away slowly and go lie down somewhere cool for a while. Later, you'd go home and say to the wife, the funniest thing happened at work today. But Moses was the curious type. Plus, the voice had actually called him by name. How does a bush know your name? Well, the gist of the conversation was that God had an outrageous mission for Moses to accomplish: bring God's people out of slavery from Egypt. Now, it is really hard to find a modern equivalent to that request. I tried to think of something. It'd be like telling someone to row a boat over to China and convince everyone there that they needed to start speaking French, stop using electricity, and start eating bugs. You want us to do what? It was really that absurd. There really is no modern equivalent to what God was telling Moses to do. And there really was no ancient equivalent to that either. It was crazy. It was suicidal. And Moses was no dummy. And by the way, if your mental image of this scene is that Moses just said, "Okay, sure, that sounds great. Happy to oblige, God," well, you're not really understanding the story at all. Moses does not want to do this. It is the nuttiest thing he's ever heard of. Pharaoh is the most powerful human being on earth with the biggest army. The Hebrews were slaves. And Moses did not know a single solitary Hebrew back in Egypt. So Moses says what any of us would. "No thanks, not me. It'll never work. No one will ever believe me. How will the Hebrews know I'm not some kind of deranged person who just walked in from out of the desert?" And I think that's a perfectly normal reaction. First of all, no one ever really wants to leave their comfort zone. And Moses, well, he was doing just fine. His father-in-law was an important person in his own right. So if Moses played his cards right, he stood to inherit a lot of property and have a nice, quiet, secure remainder of his life. No reason to go off on any wild goose chases, much less attempting to launch a massive rescue operation for a ton of people he did not even know. Even if they were suffering, what did he owe to a bunch of strangers? Too bad for them, but it's not my problem. Many people who wind up doing crazy things do so because their circumstances are not so great. They are desperate, or they feel like the reward for doing something outrageous will still be worth it. They feel like they have no alternative but to act. Well, nothing like that was motivating Moses. But God tells him something that clearly made a difference. First, God says, "I'll be with you." Such a simple phrase, but how many times have we found ourselves too frightened to do something or immobilized, and the only reason we've done it is the promise that we're not alone? I'll never forget taking my first swimming lessons one summer. It was at the local YMCA. I was 5 years old, and I was terrified. I was in the tadpole group, you know how they do things at the Y. But my instructor, she was this wonderful lifeguard who would literally hold on to me in the water as I learned. She would hold me up. She kept telling me, "I'm right here. I'll never let you go." And she never did, until I could forward crawl through the water all by myself with her right by my side. I trusted her, and I could do anything as long as she was with me. Her presence took away my fear and filled me with confidence and with courage. The other thing God tells Moses is, "Tell them I sent you. I am, and I am sending you." Which is actually a play on words, and if you read it in the original Hebrew, it's kind of funny, on purpose, because the word "I am" is in fact God's very own name. I am who I am what I have been, I am what I will be. It is past, present, and future tense all at once. And if you're really into grammar, it's what you would call the present perfect progressive tense. God's name is an action verb. It's always I am, and it's pronounced Yahweh. Why does that matter? Because here was a promise of presence. I'll be with you. I'll never let you go. Amplified by the promise that the one making the promise is always present. That the present moment matters, but that in every moment of our lives, whether we are aware of it or not, no matter what happens, no matter how frightened we are, no matter how despondent, no matter how weary, no matter how much we grieve or worry, no matter the stuff we have been through, no matter the injustice we witness or suffer, no matter how insane the world seems to be, and no matter what challenges lie ahead of us, I am. So that presence goes above and beyond any of those things that hold us back from our destiny or from anything that moves us from a place of inner peace or from anything that would keep us from making justice and peace a reality. It's the presence of someone known and trusted. It's not anonymous. It is profoundly personal. And here's what distinguishes that presence from anything else that might catch our attention or that tells us we should be fearful of each other. The presence never compels us to do anything that would bring harm to anyone. It never calls us into conflict, but at the same time provides the courage to stand up for what's right. It enlists us in the cause of justice and peace. And in the case of Moses, the unlikely, even crazy thing he was being called to do was a rescue mission born of compassion. It was not something that would serve the needs of Moses. He had nothing to gain. He could very well lose everything, even his own life. So the presence, the great I am, is always about what we do for the sake of others, not for ourselves. It's self-giving. It's not self-serving. At the same time, that presence never requires us to do anything that's not ultimately good for us either. And that's because serving, helping, and loving others is precisely what the presence knows will make us more fully human. It might not always be easy, but it's what we're created and what we're called to do. It's about moving out of our comfort zone to discover that we are more alive when we're reaching beyond ourselves, even if it's risky and scary to do that. It's what separates merely living from a life well lived. The presence, the I am, makes that possible. And I don't believe God's presence ever asks us to calculate and wait for a day when all things will be made whole, to passively sit around and hope for something better to happen. The presence is about us, you and me, being empowered to act when we believe that we're not wise enough or strong enough or wealthy or powerful enough, or that we don't have enough time or energy to make a difference. The presence says, yes, you do. You know why? Because I am with you. And again, the other important thing about God's name, Yahweh, I am, is the realization that that presence is always present, whether or not we're even aware of it. Sometimes it takes something really remarkable to bring us into that awareness of presence, like, let's say, a burning bush. Or more likely for you and me, it's the sight or the sound or the touch of something or someone when we sense a powerful connection. If you've ever had a baby grip its hand around your finger, that is presence. If you have ever looked out over a meadow or a mountain range, or stood on the shore, or watched a hummingbird hover, or found yourself lost in a Van Gogh painting or a Mozart sonata, and sensed your cares flowing away like the tide, and taken a deep breath at the beauty of that present moment and realized how lucky you are to be alive, that is presence. And if you have ever found the courage to stand up and speak up when someone else needed your presence and your voice to be their ally and their advocate, no matter the cost to you, where does that courage come from? It comes from the great I am. The presence that is always there, always has been, and always will be. The presence that knits all of humanity and all of creation together in an interwoven web of loving kindness. In this COVID moment we're living through together, these past almost 6 months now, we know how hard it's been. The lives lost, the families torn, the economic destruction, the isolation and loneliness, the absolute weirdness of how we're living and working and going to school and attempting to refigure what normal even looks like. And people are hurting, frightened, depressed, feeling defeated and angry. And in many ways, we're waiting for a cure, a vaccine, a sane way out of this insane situation, waiting for things to get back to normal. And in the midst of that, we're confronted by the ugly reality that we live in a society that does not value the lives of Black people, the reality that long-standing systems of injustice remain firmly in place, the reality that when those who are devalued and oppressed cry out for justice, they're regarded as criminals instead of fellow citizens. They're treated like objects, like things, rather than human beings who are beloved and valued by God. So, it's not a comfortable zone we're in right now. But acting in ways that blame others for problems that we have created and that we must own up to, or stoking fear and paranoia of the other, or waiting for the world to return magically somehow to the way we think it should be, or to the way it was, that's never the answer. That is not what we're called to do. The answer is recognizing the presence that always was, is, and will be with us, and that inevitably calls us to move forward in the face of any challenge. We have work to do today, sacred work. Even in the midst of living in ways we never would have imagined before, we have so many opportunities to create and live into new ways of learning and connecting, and seeking justice and working for peace, serving and loving our neighbors, and being the church together. The great news is we're not doing any of that on our own. We have each other and the great I Am who knits us together into one human family is always with us.